Hello, Biology 100 students. Welcome to your lecture on tissues, the fabric of life. So tissues are groups of specialized cells that are similar in structure and perform a common function. And they are truly the link between cells and organs. There are 4 different types of tissues we're going to talk about today: epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. So the first tissue here is epithelial tissues. So epithelium here has the prefix on it, epi, which means on top. So epithelium is found on the surface of your skin, but it's also found on internal body surfaces. For example, on the inside of your cheek, in the vagina. If we look down the throat and the trachea, there's epithelium there too. So it's layers of cells that protect underlying tissue. So that's function number 1 right here. It also helps to absorb nutrients. For example, the small intestine has an epithelial layer that absorbs nutrients from the food that we eat. It also prevents friction. If we think about the vagina is lined with squamous epithelium that has a lot of mucus in there that prevents friction. And of course, it also forms secretory glands. Sebaceous glands, ceraminous glands are all formed through epithelial tissue. Okay, we can classify epithelium in 2 ways. The first of these ways is to classify it by the cell shape. And basically, epithelial cell shapes can be divided into 3 categories. The first of these categories is the squamous or squamous cells. These are flat, scale-like or plate-like cells that we tend to find on the surface of the skin, where it's there for protection, or we also find it lining the alveoli of the lungs, where it's there for absorption. The second cell shape we see here is something called a cuboidal cell. And you can see these cells have a nice sort of square appearance and a circular nucleus. That is characteristic. And we tend to find those in places like the kidneys, where we have absorption going on. And the final cell shape we have here is something called the columnar cells. So columnar cells are tall and column-like, and they also have a nice elliptical nucleus, and we tend to find those in areas like the small intestine and large intestine, where we have absorption of nutrients or water. Okay, underlying all epithelial tissues is an acellular membrane called the basement membrane. The basement membrane separates that epithelial tissue from the underlying tissue, which is usually connective tissue. Another point I should make about epithelium is it is avascular. That is, it does not have a blood supply. So all the nutrients that need to supply that have to diffuse through that basement membrane up into the epithelium above. Okay, so I said one way that we classify epithelium was based on cell shape. We also classify it based on the number of layers present. So for example, if we have a single layered epithelium, we say that epithelium is simple. In this case, it would be a simple squamous epithelium, which is a single layer of squamous plate-like cells. And simple epithelia are good for absorption, but they're not very good for protection because it's only one cell layer. In contrast, if we have something like a stratified epithelium, this would be very good for protection, but not very good for absorption, because anything that's moving from a surface here would have to go through several cell layers to get down to the bloodstream where the nutrients could be transported. So once again, epithelial tissues are classified according to cell shape and also degree of layering. Okay, here for example we have our simple squamous epithelium, and again this is not going to be good for protection because we only have one cell layer between us and then the underlying connective tissue and blood vessels. But it will be good for absorption. So we tend to find simple squamous epithelium in areas like the lungs where we're absorbing gases across the alveoli into the bloodstream. Another place we have simple squamous cells is in some frog skin, right? Frogs can actually respire a little bit through their skin, so this is actually a top-down view of these simple squamous cells in frog skin. Okay, simple cuboidal epithelium. This is an example of simple cuboidal epithelium. So here we can see a tube. The inside part here is called a lumen, and then the surfaces that are facing that lumen are called the luminal surface of these cells. And we tend to find simple cuboidal epithelium in areas where we're having absorption or secretion, for example, the kidneys. So one cell layer makes it very easy to pull stuff out of this tube and move it back across these cells back into the bloodstream. Okay, here's what simple cuboidal would actually look like under the microscope. Again, we have kidney tubules right here, and a better representation of very nice simple cuboidal cells, nice circular nucleus right there. Okay, simple columnar epithelium. Again, we tend to find this in the digestive tract. For example, in the small intestines, we have these long, tall cells with an elliptical kidney bean-shaped nucleus. Okay, and then we have something called stratified squamous epithelium. Stratified here means it's got several layers, and squamous means the top cells, the apical cells, are flat or plate-like. Again, what will this be good for? Well, it probably won't be good for absorption because anything that's moving from here has to go through 20 or 30 cells in order to get to the blood vessels down in the dermis. And so not good for absorption, but it is good for protection, right? It protects the underlying layers and prevents those tissues from abrasion or desiccation. Okay, another place where we have a stratified squamous epithelium is inside the esophagus and the vagina, anywhere where there's lots of friction. Okay, think about your dog. If you have a dog, my dog is really good at swallowing bones he finds in the park. And so a lot of times I'll see him bend over and grab something and I'll be like, Clancy, don't. And as soon as I do that, he won't even chew. He'll just kind of like envelop himself around these sharp shards of bone, and somehow he doesn't cause himself hemorrhage because we have this nice stratified epithelium that reduces the chances of puncture due to all the cell layers, and it prevents friction. Okay, our next epithelium here is transitional epithelium, and as the name implies, the shape of these cells will transition depending on whether or not this organ that the epithelium is in is under a load or whether or not that organ is being stretched. So one place we find transitional epithelium is in the urinary bladder. And so initially you can take a look at it and it looks like it's maybe a stratified columnar cells, nice sort of elliptical nuclei. But what happens as the bladder stretches out, when it fills with urine, these cells are going to stretch out and look more flat or plate-like, so they'll look more squamous instead. So that's why we call it transitional epithelium. Okay, our next group of tissues are something called connective tissues. Now, connective tissues are found underneath epithelial tissues. They support organs and connect body parts, and they contain very few living cells. As opposed to epithelium, which was primarily cells, connective tissues mainly consist of something called the extracellular matrix. And matrix is a non-cellular material which consists of fibers and something called ground substance. Now, there are two different types of connective tissue. We either call them generalized fibrous or they're then specialized. So specialized is anything that doesn't really have a fibrous appearance. Okay, so let's talk about the fibrous connective tissues. These provide strength, support, and flexibility. We have lots of fibrous connective tissues in the bodies, and so the fibers here are secreted by fiber-generating cells called fibroblasts. And then these cells and the fibers they secrete are surrounded by a gelatinous, gel-like ground substance that we're going to take a look at. So the three types of fibers we're likely to see, one is collagen fibers. Collagen are very strong, they stretch a little bit. We have elastic fibers, which stretch a lot. And then we have something called reticular fibers, which are more there to make a reticular matrix for filtering organs like lymph nodes. Okay, let's take a look at an artist's rendition of a generalized fibrous connective tissue. So first what I want you to see in here is the gray area that's making up the majority of the tissue is what we call that ground substance. It's a gelatinous, non-cellular material. Now, we also have fibers in here. That's a big part of fibrous connective tissues. Here would be a nice, what we call collagen fiber, and that fiber is secreted by the cell here called the fibroblast. Okay, we find some reticular fibers in there. We can see right there, okay, reticular fibers, and then we have some elastic fibers up there as well. Now, you can see there's not a whole lot of cells in there. We had our fibroblasts. We also have some white blood cells that are sort of hanging out in the connective tissue, surveilling it because it's a good place to get an infection. So some connective tissues are very vascular. They have a very good blood supply, but some are not. The connective tissues underneath your epidermis are very vascular, and there's a great blood supply in there. Okay, so fibrous connective tissue is divided into two groups. We either say that it's loose or it's dense. And by loose and dense, we're talking about how loosely or densely woven the fibers are. So here's an example of a loose connective tissue. This is areolar connective tissue, and what you can see in here is the fibers have a lot of space in between them, and then the dots in here are probably the nuclei of the cells, the fibroblasts that are secreting those fibers. So loose connective tissues like areolar connective tissue are pretty elastic. The good thing about them is they're great reservoirs for water. In veterinary patients, when we have a dog or something like that that's dehydrated, and you could go in and do like a venipuncture and give them fluids that way. But another thing we can do is actually pull up a flap of skin on the back and just stick a needle underneath that skin and squeeze the IV bag and put fluids in that way. And as it turns out, this areolar connective tissue is wonderful at absorbing that water and then distributing it into the bloodstream very, very quickly. Okay, our next fibrous connective tissue is dense regular fibrous connective tissue. If If we have a loose, we must have a dense. What you can see here is there's a lot less space in between the fibers here, and in this particular tissue, it looks like the fibers should be oriented all in the same direction. Now, dense, regular fibrous connective tissue is found in ligaments and tendons, and it's very strong if you pull it in the direction of the fibers. But it can be pretty weak if you hit it in a direction perpendicular to the fibers. So you think about somebody that's running with a football, and then they get hit from the side on the knee. It's very easy to tear that cruciate ligament that's holding the knee together, because if we hit it from the side, we're hitting it perpendicular to the fibers, and in that case, the fibers tear very readily. And the bad thing about this type of connective tissue is it's not very vascular, and so once it's torn, it doesn't tend to heal. Usually has to be repaired surgically. Okay, our next tissue here is elastic connective tissue. Elastic connective tissue has a lot of those elastic fibers in it. Where do we find it? Well, we find it in the aorta and blood vessels that have to stretch a lot, so it's very, very elastic and recoils very easily. Okay, now that we've talked about fibrous connective tissues, we're going to shift gears and talk about specialized connective tissues. Now, what makes them specialized? Well, they don't fit the normal description of having fibers and cells. So these are things like cartilage. So cartilage is a connective tissue that we find on the surfaces of bones. We find it in the bridge of the nose and also in between the vertebrae of the back. Now, cartilage here consists of an extracellular matrix made up of collagen and water, and it's often there to reduce friction. And the cells that produce the cartilage are called chondrocytes and chondroblasts. And the thing about cartilage is it's avascular. It doesn't have a blood supply. So once it's torn or damaged, it does not heal very readily. Oftentimes, it needs surgical correction. The next specialized connective tissue is osseous tissue or bone. We all know where bone is in the body, right? We have 206 bones in the body. All of them are made up of this specialized osseous tissue or bone tissue. And so this bone tissue consists of calcium phosphate in there. The cells that make the bone are called osteoblasts. We have other cells that actually break down the bone called osteoclasts. Now, the ground substance here, again, is calcium phosphate. It's very, very hard. And we have two different types of bone. We have compact bone, which is the hard bone that we find on the surface of, for example, the femur. But then we also have spongy bone on the inside. So if you've ever been like eating chicken wings and you bite into the end of a chicken wing, and there's kind of like that, I guess, the spongy area in there, and the like bloody stuff coming out, that is where we have our red bone marrow. So one of the functions of bones is to actually produce red blood cells. Okay, our next group of specialized connective tissues is adipose tissue. Now, adipose tissue, otherwise known as fat tissue, is sometimes classified as a loose connective tissue, so be aware of that, but we're going to call it specialized. We're calling it specialized because it consists of these cells in here. We don't see any fibers. The cells here are called adipocytes, and adipocytes are very large cells. They have sort of a peripheral nucleus here, and the majority of the cell is taken up with this vacuole in there that accumulates triglyceride. Now, the interesting thing about fat cells is if you go on a diet, you're on the keto diet, you lose 15, 20 pounds, you feel great, the cells haven't gone away. They're still there. They're shrunk, but they're waiting for that double chocolate fudge sundae, and then they're just going to go what and swell back up again. So that's how adipose tissue is kind of out to get you. Okay, our next specialized connective tissue is blood. Now, blood is a connective tissue that consists of cells. Again, we have red blood cells or erythrocytes. We have white blood cells or leukocytes, but we also have an extracellular matrix, which is called the blood plasma. And that's just a fluid through which the blood cells are suspended. Now, blood has several different functions. It transports oxygen and carbon dioxide throughout the body, and of course it also transports our white blood cells, which are there to deal with immune defense. Okay, now we're going to shift gears and move on to muscle tissue, our third tissue type. So the function of muscle tissue is to contract and produce movement. It's the only tissue that does that. There are three different types of muscle tissue, including skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. Okay, our first group of muscle tissue is skeletal muscle. As the name implies, we find skeletal muscle on the skeleton. And one thing you should know about skeletal muscle, it's voluntary. It allows us to move our arms and legs voluntarily. The other thing you need to know about skeletal muscle is the fibers or the cells are really freaking long. They're really long fibers. They can be up to this long in your leg. The other thing about the fibers is that they are striated. If you look closely, there's little perpendicular lines going through there. And the last thing is they have multiple nuclei in there. So each cell is long, striated, and multiple nuclei. And last but not least, it's voluntary. Okay, our next muscle tissue is something called cardiac muscle. Now, as the name implies, cardiac muscle is found in the heart, and the muscle tissue here is involuntary. We cannot voluntarily contract our heart, unfortunately, but the tissue is similar to skeletal muscle in that it is striated. There are lines going down through it. The other thing you should know is that the cells tend to be a lot smaller than skeletal muscle, and they only tend to have 1 to 2 nuclei per cell. Another unique thing about cardiac muscle is these cells are separated by something called intercalated discs. And these intercalated discs allow for synchronized muscle contraction in the heart tissue. And this is important because the function of the heart is to contract and move blood out of the heart towards the lungs, etc. So it's important that it can do it in a coordinated manner. Okay, our final type of muscle tissue is something called smooth muscle. Now, as the name implies here, smooth muscle does not have any striations. So unlike skeletal muscle, unlike cardiac muscle, smooth muscle is smooth looking. So what we see in the cells individually are very, very small spindle-shaped cells with a single nucleus there. They're involuntary. We cannot voluntarily control the smooth muscle, and this is a problem sometimes because smooth muscle is found where? In your intestines right there. So if you're ever sitting on a date or in a job interview and for some reason your intestine just starts to go, that sound is called borborygmus, and it's due to the involuntary contraction of the intestine, particularly the large intestine. As food moves up the large intestine, gets about halfway across, then we have something happen called mass peristalsis, and all the feces that's in there goes okay. It can be quite noisy and embarrassing if you're in a quiet room, and it's all because the fact that smooth muscle cannot be controlled voluntarily. Okay, our last tissue type here is something called nervous tissue, and nervous tissue is found in the brain, found in the spinal cord, and also found in all the peripheral nerves. So nervous tissue consists of cells called neurons, and neurons are specialized cells like this cell here, which are designed to transmit electrical potentials. We also have another type of cell called neuroglial cells, which do not transmit electrical potentials, but they do help out in other ways. So the neuron's the primary cell we're going to concentrate on today, and the neuron has 3 different parts: a cell body, something called an axon, and then up here we have dendrites. So the cell body is where the nucleus is located and most of the organelles are located. The dendrites receive stimulation from adjacent neurons, so they're basically hooked in the whole matrix of other neurons up there. And then the axon is where the electrical cable is that actually generates and transmits electrical signals. Now it's important to realize that axons can be very long. We said in a previous lecture that cells tend to be small and microscopic. Well, this is one exception. Think about the muscles in your toes, or the muscles that move your toes are located in your foot, and the neurons that control that are actually located in the lower part of your back. So the cell bodies would be up in the sacral region, probably your back, maybe a little higher, and then those actual axons might be more than a couple feet long that go down to the muscles of your feet. So this is an instance where we have a very long but very skinny cell, our neurons. Okay, this is another diagram of a neuron. I just want to point some things out we couldn't see before. Now, once again, we have our cell body up there and our cell body with our dendrites coming out. Again, those dendrites receive stimulation from other neurons. And then we have the axon, the long electrical cable, which generates the action potential. But what you can see right here is that axon is covered with something called Schwann cells. Now, Schwann cells are cells that help to insulate the axon, and by insulating it, they help to speed up the rate of nerve transmission. They also can help repair the axon if it's damaged or severed. Okay, you've reached the end of the tissues lecture. As always, if you have some fuzzy points and you're not sure, go back and review those points in the lecture. If you have any additional questions, you can always reach out to me by email or by text. Talk to you later.